We have seen Jesus walking with the missionaries that we've been reading about in the second half of the book of Acts lately. If you've been part of this series, you'll remember that we've been tracking this team of people throughout the book of Acts, and lately they have gone to some cities and shared the gospel in those places. They've gone to Philippi and then Thessaloniki and then Berea, and on that journey they have had hostility at every step of the way. Things have been very difficult. Those opportunities for ministry have been joyful. Some of them have been effective, but they've also been full of fear. There's been great opposition and even violence in each of those places. The only place that received them with open arms was Berea, but it turned out that the people who opposed them from Thessaloniki followed them and opposed them in Berea too. So it's been hardship after hardship. And at one point, you'll remember a couple weeks ago this happened. The Apostle Paul separates from this team of missionaries, partly perhaps because of how dangerous things are, but he heads to Athens alone. And in the last 2 weeks, we talked about Paul in Athens. And then today, Paul leaves Athens again all by himself, and he heads to the city of Corinth. And so we pick up our story there today in Acts chapter 18, beginning at verse 1. So hear the word of God. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night, the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." He stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. And skipping a few verses, but Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What Paul is going through in this part of the book of Acts and in this text that we read too, it is something that would seem impossible for most of us, right? I mean, his life is so hard right now. He has been cast out of town after town. He's been in prison. He's been stoned, if you remember that, and left for dead. He's been dragged and arrested and brought before tribunals. All of the opposition right now in the book of Acts is targeted at Paul. We're calling this series The Empire Strikes Back, right? Because not just the Roman Empire, but we have all these other powerful forces in the world are opposing the spread of the gospel. These things are opposing these Christians as they share the gospel, and all of it right now, Paul is just getting the brunt of it. And so now he's all by himself. He is lonely. He is discouraged. He is fearful. Betsy pointed that out too, that there's a great deal of fear in the text right now. And if you look back on his ministry, it has not been 100% effective. It has been wonderful. Lots of good things have happened, but there have definitely been some failures along the way as well. And so Paul is in this really hard place. And then by himself, he comes to Corinth. And you know what? It doesn't seem to get much better when he gets to Corinth. The Jews in Corinth are against him. The text actually says they revile him, right? I mean, that's a strong word. They use the law against Paul. They drag him before the authorities later on in the text. There's lots of opposition. They have this angry verbal exchange, so we know there's some verbal abuse going on. And if we read between the lines, there's certainly some physical abuse too, as they bring him to the tribunal. And as we read other situations that Paul has been in, we can easily assume that there is some physical danger here for Paul as well. We also know that when Paul comes to Corinth, he is fearing his life. Two of the people that he meets in the text that we just read, Paul actually mentions them in another letter. When he's writing to the church in Rome, he mentions these two people that he's with right now that he's just met in Corinth. He came by himself, but he's met people right away. And these two people he mentions in his letter to the Romans that they risked their necks to save his life. And we don't know if that's here or if it's later in Ephesus, but we know that there is definitely this element of danger that Paul is experiencing. He is fearful here in the midst of Corinth. And you know what else? He's also poor. He has been going around doing ministry, and all along he's been supported financially by the Christians in other places. Not all along, but almost the entire time. He's been able to do the ministry that he feels called to full time because of their support. But here in Corinth, he has had to go back to work and support himself. He's a tent maker, or a better translation might be a leather worker. And instead of having to do ministry, or being able, I should say, to do ministry full time, he's had to take on this full time work and start a business and do these sorts of things. The text says that at this point, even though he wants to be doing ministry full time, he is only able to share the gospel every Sabbath. And if you know that Paul writes letters to the church in Corinth later on, right? We've got 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and in those letters, we find out a little bit about what the church in Corinth will be like, and probably the seeds of what it will be like have already started as Paul gets here. And so in the midst of all of these hardships that Paul is already facing, we know that to some degree the church in Corinth also has these internal problems. They have these arguments that they're fighting about, and challenges like that. So there are this conflict. So all of that, right? Would any of us want any of that in our lives, right? Hard stuff that he is facing. And even in this letter of the 1 Corinthians, he writes that when he came to Corinth, he came in fear and trembling. That's how he came. That was his heart and his attitude when he came to Corinth. He's even afraid to speak. And so for Paul, this has got to be one of those times when life just seems absolutely impossible to live, right? I mean, any one of these things might be too much for some of us. Those things might crush us, and so it is a very hard time for Paul. Now, I want to ask you today: when was the last time that you had a season of your life when life seemed impossible? Maybe it was when you moved out of your parents' house for the first time. Maybe it was when you experienced a season of joblessness. Maybe it was when you had your first child and you were learning how to be a parent. Or when you were trying to get some degree that was so difficult for you, trying to pay those bills and afford it. Maybe it was a journey you had trying to conceive a child, and that journey was never successful for you and for your spouse, and that whole season of loss and hope was a difficult, almost impossible season in life for you. Maybe there was a time when you lost someone, maybe a spouse, maybe a child. Was there a time in your life when you actually feared for your life itself? When you were in that season, and maybe you're in that season now, right? But when you were in that season, did you struggle to have faith? Was it hard to believe in the promises of Jesus when you were in the midst of whatever that is that you're thinking of right now? Was that a challenge for you to believe those promises when you're in the middle of pain and fear? That's where Paul is right now as we read this. And somehow, Paul, in the midst of these horrible things, is able to have amazing faith. In a moment, we're going to see how he does that. But Paul's faith is not just something that sees him through this time, right? It's not just something that gets Paul from point A to point B, hunkers him down, and just gets through this dark and horrible time. It's actually something that enables Paul to absolutely thrive. I mean, can you imagine going through those horrible things that Paul's going through and just thriving in life? Wouldn't that be amazing to have that kind of faith? To have so much faith that we can thrive, that we can know Jesus and even do ministry like Paul does in the midst of such dark times. Now, I want to take just a minute to share with you about a time in my life that was very difficult. It was about a 2-year period of time. I've been doing professional ministry in one form or another for about 32 years. I started when I was 17 years old. We would never let a 17-year-old do that, but that was okay back then, I guess. And so in that time, I've served 7 different churches and 2 different ministry organizations. And I just wanted to start that way to let you know that I love ministry. It's been a wonderful calling for me, and there's been a lot of joy in the midst of that, and successes and failures along the way, of course. But I'm grateful to be doing ministry professionally, and I love being a pastor. It's a great thing. But there was a 2-year period of time about 7 or 8 years ago when the church that I was serving went through a horrible conflict. Now, I was an associate pastor at the time, and the conflict didn't really have anything to do with me, but I also felt that I couldn't help the conflict either. And when you're in that kind of a position, I'll bet some of you have been in similar sorts of positions when you're maybe in your workplace or even in your family, when you get stuck in the middle of a conflict that impacts you, that impacts your family, and you can't do anything about it. It's one of the worst places to be, right? And so I was absolutely miserable. It affected my family. It affected my kids. My kids were young, and their faith wasn't being nurtured. It was a really, really tough time for us. And so Kathy and I decided that the best thing to do would be to get out as quickly as possible, right? And so we talked to a church in the California Bay Area, and they extended a call to us, and it was a great opportunity. It was, the kind of salary you need to live in the Bay Area was adequate. It's one of the most expensive places to live. It was one of the best school districts for in the entire nation. You don't think of California being that way, but this one was a gem, And so it was this great opportunity, and I was so thankful to have a way out of this horrible, dark time. And so Kathy and I were just rejoicing, and we thought about it and looked at our lives and prayed about it, and we called them back, and we said no. It was the hardest decision, one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, because we felt like God was actually calling us to stay in that hard time. There were some ways that God was using us, and we thought that God had a plan for that place that we were in, and so we decided we would stay. Now, it ended up being one of the most miserable experiences of my life. I'd love to tell you that, we were rewarded and it was so good. And it did last about 2 years, and then when it was over, we had another good season of ministry in the same place. But boy, those 2 years were so hard. And I always look back on those 2 years, and I wish that I could have had more faith. Because I know the Bible, we see what Paul goes through, and we know that it is possible, because Paul has done it here, to have the kind of faith, to trust in Jesus so much that even times like that can be times to thrive and to get through those seasons even with joy. And I didn't have that, and I wish I had, and so I've always looked back on that. And so when I read through here in Acts 18, and we read that Paul is going through this season, and somehow he thrives in the midst of this darkness and this fear and this miserable condition that he's in, and yet there's so much joy, and God is at work. Don't we read this and say, man, I want to know, how do we do this? How can we be in a place like that and have so much faith that things can not just be okay, but really good, really amazing, the way God wants them to be? Imagine having that faith. I mean, Paul gets to Corinth, and the Jews revile him, right? They oppose him, and he has this verbal exchange where he says, your blood be on your own heads. That means like, I'm not even responsible for you anymore. You're doing this to yourselves, right? He shakes the dust from his clothes, and you can how serious that is. That's this motion to say that I'm done with you. This, what your behavior is I condemn that behavior and I move on. There's this conflict. That's the kind of life the kinds of circumstances that Paul finds himself in, and yet, did you read? He stays. He doesn't go away. He stays there for 18 months. A year and a half, one of the longest places probably that Paul has ever stayed. He commits to these people because of his faith. How can we nurture a faith like that? When life seems impossible, Acts 18 shows us how to have amazing faith. Because Paul, in this text, he frames his life in such a way that he is able to live out his faith. Let's just take a really quick look at this text and see how Paul does that. How does he frame his life to nurture that kind of faith, to enable him to thrive in these circumstances that are so difficult? And the first thing I want to call out of this text is that Paul stays the course. Okay? He is in a hard place. He comes with fear and trembling. But when he comes to Corinth, he does, there is this sense, there's more to it, but there is this sense that he hunkers down and he carries out the actions of his faith. He does the things that he feels called to. It's tempting, I'm sure, to quit, to get out, but instead he presses on. He has, even in the period of time in this text when he has no financial support, the text says that every single Sabbath he goes to the synagogue and tries to convince the Jews and the Greeks that Jesus is the Messiah. Every opportunity he gets, he keeps doing those actions, right? Paul goes through the motions. He might not feel excited about it. He might, but he might not. He might not have that energy to do those things, but he makes those choices to do that. It says even that he was afraid to speak. And we know that he was afraid to speak because of what Jesus says later on, and because of something else Paul writes in 1 Corinthians. He has that fear, but he speaks anyway. He does that. He even takes this kind of strategic move, right? Where he leaves one house and he moves in right next door to the synagogue. Good strategy right there, right? You can go and there's Paul, seeing him do his thing, right? How easy would it be in the midst of that hardship to not live next door to the synagogue? But that's what he does. A friend of mine lost some family members in a horrible car accident. And in the season that he's had for trying to have some healing from that, one of the things he says that has brought him the most comfort was coming to church every Sunday. He's angry at God, did not want to come to church, but knew that if he would just practice those tangible actions, that God could perhaps use that in his life. And that has been one of the things that God has used to bring healing into his life. These actions of faith, these steps of faith, God can use those, and we see Paul just staying the course. He comes to Corinth, and instead of quitting, instead of hiding, he just does carries out his faith. So that's the first way we see Paul nurturing this kind of faith that he has that helps him thrive. But he also doesn't do it alone. He gets to Corinth alone, but he doesn't keep doing it alone. And that's the second thing we notice, is that Paul is he is not just staying the course, but he's also staying connected. He's building these connections with people that nurture his faith, that enable him to carry these things out. He meets Priscilla and Aquila. These are these two refugees who are living in Corinth. They have been cast out of Rome because they're Christians. The emperor has told all of the Christians to go at this point, and so they have fled for their lives, and they've ended up in Corinth. They are exactly like the so many refugees we have today who have been cast out, expelled from their countries because they are Christians. They're just like that. Paul meets them there and joins with them, and they start supporting each other. They start a business together, leatherworking, tent making, whatever you want to call it. They're doing that together. And they also start doing ministry together. We don't read that much about that in our text, but later on, Priscilla and Aquila go with Paul to Ephesus. So we know that they're partners in ministry to him. He builds that relationship right away. And then after that, Silas and Timothy arrive. Now, as soon as Silas and Timothy arrive, did you notice in the text, Paul is now able to do ministry full time again. So it's very likely, it's almost 100% certain, but not quite, that when Silas and Timothy come, they have brought financial support with them from the Macedonian Christians. And that's enabling Paul now to get on with his full-time ministry once again. Silas and Timothy, are also part of this mission team that had been going around. So they are deeply connected to Paul. So not only do they bring this financial support, but they bring their friendship and their support in lots of other ways. So we've got Priscilla and Aquila and Silas and Timothy. Paul has this community of support. And that's one of the things it takes to have faith in the midst of an impossible season like that, is to stay connected to people. Staying the course in our faith, Paul does that. We see him doing that. We see Paul staying connected with other people. And these things are obvious in the text. But as we are seeing Paul do these things, suddenly someone else shows up. And when this other person shows up, that's when we discover by far the best way that Paul is nurturing his faith in the midst of an impossible time. And it's something that we can do too, because he doesn't just stay the course and stay connected. He also trusts in Jesus Christ. Because when this other person shows up, it's verse 9, and you might think it's God, and actually it is. It's Jesus. Jesus comes and gives him that message, right? He says, do not fear, do not be afraid. He says, I am with you. I'm going to take care of you. You are not going to be hurt. No one's going to lay a hand on you. And you know what? And don't be afraid to speak, he says. And he says, there are many people in my city who belong to me. That's this message. And Paul hears that, and we know that Paul relies on Jesus. He trusts Jesus. He wants Jesus to do all of the hard work in the midst of this, and knows that he will, right? We have that command in the New Testament a lot, and in the Old Testament too, especially in the Old Testament, where an angel or God comes and says, do not fear. And usually this kind of theophany is a generic sort of thing. It's very similar every single time, where the do not fear command is made to someone because they're in the presence of God, or they're in the presence of a holy messenger or something like that. And so they're afraid, and the person says, oh, don't be afraid. And that's as far as it goes. But this one is so different. Jesus comes, and Paul's not afraid of Jesus at this point in that way, right? Jesus comes and he says, don't be afraid. I will protect you. No one's going to lay a hand on you. Jesus comes and eases Paul's fear for the exact things that he's afraid of, right? Because Jesus knows Paul, and he's going to protect Paul. Now, you might say, oh, well, that's great for Paul, but when I was in my impossible time, maybe I could envision myself staying the course and hunkering down. Maybe I could envision myself trying to build some relationships and things like that. But, trusting in Jesus, that's the hardest part, isn't it? But if I had Jesus Christ come to me in a vision like he came to Paul, it would be so much easier, right? But Jesus didn't do that for me when I was in that impossible time. But you know what? We have to remember that Paul does not have the Bible. Paul does not have the book of Acts. Paul hasn't even written his parts of the Bible yet. And so when we read in the book of Acts this message from Jesus Christ, it is as if Jesus has come to us and he is saying to us right now, do not fear. I am with you. I will keep you safe. That message is just as personal for us as it is for Paul right now in the text. And there's this other section too that he talks about. These many people are mine already, right? And we might think that sounds like safety in numbers, but it's not about that. It's actually this promise, this prophecy Jesus is giving to Paul, that Paul's ministry is going to be effective, that all of this is going to work. So Jesus even has this future promise in mind. And so with all of that, this future promise of Christ, this comfort that Jesus is going to be with Paul, all of that, we see this trust that Paul is able to give over to Jesus Christ. And so when we listen to the words of Jesus and we trust him and give those things over to him, suddenly our faith becomes nurtured. And it's in those even impossible times where we can have a faith that's so strong that not only do we just get through it, but we can even thrive, just like Paul does. And so even in the darkest times, when life is challenging, even when there are hopeless situations, even if we are entering into a season of life where we have fear and trembling, just like Paul does, even in those kinds of seasons, we can still have the same kind of faith that Paul does. We can even thrive when we stay the course, when we stay connected, and when, above all, we trust in Jesus. For there is no one we can trust more. Amen.